You would not believe what really happened on my third week working as a bartender in a luxury Las Vegas resort, because I barely believe it myself. I stepped into this job thinking rules were simple, guests were untouchable, and everything dangerous stayed on the gaming floor. I was wrong, and it took only 2 women from Los Angeles to push me straight into a choice that could have ended my career before it even began. This is the night I learned how thin the line really is in a city that never forgives mistakes. Listen carefully, because nothing in this story should have happened, yet every step felt impossible to refuse. I arrived in Las Vegas with the idea that I would take any job that paid the bills, but I never expected that my first real job here would throw me into the kind of temptation people only talk about in whispers. The luxury resort bar was supposed to be simple, a place to learn, to stay invisible, and to follow every rule that management drilled into us on day one. Yet everything shifted on a warm Friday night when 2 women from Los Angeles sat at my bar and looked at me like they already knew I would break at least one rule for them before the night ended. Something in their eyes made me feel seen in a way I could not explain, and I felt myself leaning toward a choice I should have walked away from. Before I take you into the forbidden part of this night, tell us where you're watching from and on which device. Like, subscribe, and share if you want more real stories from behind hotel walls. And tell me honestly, what would you have done if you were in my shoes? I started that evening shift nervous as always, because everything in this resort felt larger than life, from the polished marble floors to the constant sound of slot machines echoing in the distance. I was a 25-year-old kid from Serbia who barely understood how a place like this operated, yet every manager watched us like hawks and expected perfection from the moment we clocked in. My bar station was inside a private lounge near the high-limit area, a space reserved for guests who expected privacy, fast service, and absolute discretion. That pressure made me feel like every drink I poured was a test I had to pass. That night began quietly, and I actually felt relieved, not knowing how violently that calm would shift. The women entered just past 8, walking with a smooth confidence that immediately separated them from the usual party crowd. The one in front wore a dark green dress that shimmered every time she moved, and she carried herself as if she had spent her entire life in places where attention followed her naturally. Her friend was quieter, softer around the edges, and she watched everything with calm curiosity, as if she was reading the room long before she even sat down. They both thanked me politely when I greeted them, but the way the dominant one looked at me made my stomach tighten in a way I could not hide. I felt her noticing that reaction, and for a brief second, I forgot every rule printed in our employee handbook. I prepared their drinks slowly, pretending that my hands were steady, even though my chest felt like it was pounding louder than the music outside. The dominant one leaned forward as I placed her glass down, and she asked for my name with a smile that felt almost rehearsed, like she knew exactly how much pressure to apply to make someone forget where they stood. I gave her my name, and she repeated it in a way that sounded more intimate than anything a guest should ever say to an employee. Her friend watched silently, as if she already knew how the night would unfold if I was not careful. I felt my guard slip, even though nothing inappropriate had been said out loud. They asked where I was from, and when I told them I was from Serbia, something sparked in their eyes, as if they suddenly decided I was more interesting than the overpriced cocktails they were holding. The quieter one asked how long I had been in Vegas, and when I said only 3 weeks, both of them exchanged a look that made my nerves spike. There was something about their interest that felt too focused, too intentional, as if they were not just making conversation but testing how inexperienced I really was. I felt flattered, confused, and embarrassingly curious about what their intentions might be. In that moment, I realized how easy it is for a guest to pull you into a space you are not supposed to enter. They stayed at the bar longer than most guests ever do, and their questions became more personal with each round they ordered. I tried to keep my responses safe, but the dominant one kept pushing, asking about my life, my hopes, and why I left Serbia for this chaotic desert city. She listened with sharp attention, tilting her head slightly as if she was studying every word and every hesitation. Her friend stayed quiet, but kept watching me with a soft, almost knowing expression that made me feel like she saw straight through every nervous smile I tried to hide. The air between us grew heavier, and I felt the shift before anything concrete was said. When guests stay too long, managers usually walk by, but that night no one seemed to notice how intensely the three of us were connected at that bar. I could feel the temperature rising inside my chest, and every time the dominant one leaned closer, the space between us felt too small to breathe normally. I knew I should have stepped away, counted glasses, cleaned the bar, done anything to regain control. Instead, I leaned closer without realizing it, drawn in by something that felt too dangerous to examine honestly. The quieter woman finally spoke again, asking if it was against the rules for a bartender to show guests around after work. My pulse jumped so sharply I felt it in my throat, because that question alone could have gotten me written up if a supervisor overheard it. I tried to give a neutral answer, saying our policy kept staff and guests separate outside working hours, but the dominant one interrupted and asked if I ever broke rules before. Her voice dropped lower, soft but deliberate, and my entire body went tense from the weight of the implication. The quieter one watched both of us with wide eyes, as if she could not decide whether to encourage the moment or warn me away from it. I felt the pull in my chest again, the one that made me forget that I was a brand new employee in a resort that fired people faster than it hired them. When my shift finally ended, they were still sitting at the bar, and I knew that if I walked past them without saying anything, the tension would follow me home and haunt me. I hesitated for several seconds before stepping toward them, and the dominant one stood up in a slow, deliberate motion that made my breath hitch. She asked where I was heading after work, and her tone made it sound like the answer mattered far more than it should. I told her I usually went straight home, and she smiled in a way that made me feel like she had already predicted that response. The quieter one lifted her glass slightly, as if giving silent approval for whatever her friend was about to do. The dominant one suggested that they show me what a real Los Angeles night feels like, even though we were in Las Vegas and not California. I knew it made no sense, but the invitation felt tempting in a way I could not logically explain. I should have said no, but the idea of returning to my small apartment alone after a night like this felt unbearable. The quieter friend nodded, and something in her eyes made me think she understood how overwhelming the moment felt for me. I followed them out of the lounge, each step heavier than the last. The private hallways behind the bar were quiet, and I felt exposed walking there with them because employees were never supposed to escort guests through staff areas. If anyone saw us together in those hallways, I would have been fired before I could even finish my next shift. The dominant one walked ahead confidently, as if these spaces belonged to her, not to the staff who spent their lives behind those doors. The quieter one stayed close to me, her arm brushing mine slightly, sending a wave of nervous heat through my chest. I could feel how dangerous every second of this was, yet I kept moving. When we reached the back exit near the staff parking area, the dominant one turned to me and asked if I understood how easy it was to lose everything in a city like this. Her smile had a different edge now, darker and more curious, and it made my stomach twist. I felt myself freeze for a second as her words settled between us. But she stepped closer, looking directly into my eyes with a confidence I could not match. The quieter one stayed slightly behind her, but her gaze softened as if she wanted to reassure me that this moment was not a trap. I inhaled slowly, realizing that I had already crossed a line simply by standing there with them. Before I take you deeper into what happened next, make sure to subscribe, like and share if you want more real stories from behind hotel doors. Tell us in the comments if you think I should have walked away at this point, or if you believe the night was already too far gone to stop. The dominant woman asked if I had ever seen the city from the rooftop of my own hotel, and I admitted I had never been up there because employees were not allowed to access guest levels without permission. She smiled as if she had expected that answer and told me that rules only mattered when someone cared enough to enforce them. Her confidence wrapped around me like a rope, pulling tighter with each word, and I felt myself leaning toward her energy even though every logical part of my brain screamed to stop. The quieter woman stepped beside me, placing her hand gently on my arm, her touch warm and reassuring in a way that made my pulse spike. I felt trapped between danger and desire, unable to choose which direction to fall. They led me through a guest elevator that required keycard access, and I watched the numbers rise as my nerves climbed even higher. The elevator doors opened to a private hallway lined with soft carpet and dim lights that made the air feel thick and intimate. I had no idea how they had access to this floor, but the dominant one moved with certainty, guiding us toward a suite like she had stayed there many times before. I hesitated outside the door, knowing that stepping inside would be the point of no return. The quieter woman noticed my hesitation and whispered that sometimes the best nights of your life begin with one reckless choice. The suite was far larger than anything I imagined, with a panoramic view of Las Vegas stretching across the entire city. The glowing skyline flooded the room with shifting colors, creating a surreal atmosphere that made everything feel unreal and dangerously inviting. The dominant woman poured drinks, while the quieter one sat beside me on the lounge chair, her presence calm and deliberate. She asked why I came to America, and when I began explaining my reasons, she watched me with an expression that felt far too intimate for someone I had met only a few hours earlier. Their energy circled around me, building tension in a way that felt both hypnotic and terrifying. The dominant woman approached again, holding 2 glasses, and she handed me one with a smile that carried too many meanings at once. She sat on the armrest beside me, and the quiet friend shifted slightly closer, surrounding me with their combined attention. The air between the 3 of us grew thick with unspoken implications, and I felt a slow burn of anticipation rise through my chest. I knew exactly what direction the night was heading, even though none of us voiced it directly. I felt myself sinking into the moment, knowing I was in a place I never should have entered. What happened next is something I cannot describe explicitly because the truth is not in the details, but in the choice itself. I made a decision that would have gotten me fired on the spot if anyone saw us. I crossed a boundary that every training session had warned me about, a boundary that separated employees from guests in a way that was never meant to blur. The night unfolded with intensity and heat, shaped by a mixture of curiosity, adrenaline, and the strange magic that only Las Vegas can create. When the city lights dimmed slightly in the early morning hours, I realized that I had gone far beyond the point of pretending this was harmless. I left the suite just before sunrise, my head spinning with everything that had happened and everything that could happen next if the hotel found out. The dominant woman watched me leave with a calm, satisfied expression, while the quieter one gave me a soft smile that carried a trace of something fragile. As I walked through the empty hallways back toward the staff elevator, every shadow felt like a camera, and every sound made me flinch. I knew I had taken a risk that could end my job instantly, yet I also knew that night would remain etched in my memory for the rest of my life. I stepped into the staff area, feeling both alive and afraid, unsure which emotion was stronger. When I returned to work 2 days later, the manager called me into his office, and my stomach dropped because I thought someone had reported me. Instead, he only reminded me about maintaining professionalism and the importance of boundaries, completely unaware of how deeply I had already crossed those boundaries. I nodded, promising to follow every rule, even though the memory of that night still buzzed like static under my skin. When I returned to the bar, I caught myself glancing at the lounge entrance, half expecting to see the two women again. They never returned, which was both a relief and a strange disappointment. I realized that sometimes Vegas gives you a moment that burns brilliantly and disappears before reality catches up. This story taught me that temptation in Las Vegas does not always shout or flash like the neon outside. Sometimes it sits at your bar, looks at you with quiet curiosity, and waits to see if you are brave enough or foolish enough to follow it. I still wonder what would have happened if I had said no that night, or if someone in the hallway had seen me stepping into a suite where I did not belong. Maybe my life would look very different now, maybe safer, maybe duller. All I know is that the line between right and wrong becomes thin in this city, especially when someone gives you a look that makes you forget every reason you came here in the first place. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were in my position?